In the winter of 1923, a 21-year-old man sat alone in an empty building on East 31st Street in Kansas City, Missouri. The electricity had been shut off weeks ago. The creditors had taken everything of value. The furniture was gone. The cameras were gone. The dreams that once filled this modest brick structure had evaporated into the cold Midwestern air, leaving behind nothing but unpaid debts and the bitter taste of failure. This young man had not eaten a proper meal in days. He survived on cold canned beans, purchased with the last few coins he could scrape together. Once a week, he walked to Union Station, not to catch a train to somewhere better, but simply to use the public bathrooms to bathe himself, because he could no longer afford running water. His name was Walter Elias Disney, and at this moment, he was not the visionary entertainment mogul, whose name would one day become synonymous with childhood wonder, animated magic, and a global empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars. He was simply a bankrupt young man, sitting in the ruins of his first company, wondering if he would ever work in animation again. This is the story that almost never gets told. This is the origin story behind the origin story, the hidden chapter of struggle, humiliation, and devastating betrayal that forged the most famous entertainment brand in human history. Before there was Disneyland, before there was Mickey Mouse, before there was even a Disney studio in Hollywood, there was Graham Films, a tiny animation company in Kansas City that collapsed so completely that its founder was left with nothing but $40, a cardboard suitcase, and an unfinished reel of film. And what happened after that collapse, the journey that followed, would lead to one of the most infamous acts of corporate betrayal in entertainment history, a betrayal so devastating that it could have destroyed Walt Disney forever, but instead became the catalyst for the creation of the most recognizable cartoon character the world has ever known. Welcome to Coded Dark Wealth, if you find yourself captivated by the hidden histories behind the world's greatest fortunes. If you want to understand how failure, loss, and even treachery can become the unlikely foundation for unimaginable success, then you are exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the story we are about to unfold contains lessons about resilience, creative genius, and in the dangerous business of trusting the wrong people that remain as relevant today as they were a century ago. This is the dark story of Walt Disney's first studio, a tale of bankruptcy, betrayal, and the unlikely birth of Mickey Mouse. To understand how Walt Disney ended up broke and desperate in Kansas City, we must first travel back to the beginning, to the formative years that shaped his artistic ambitions and his relentless drive to create moving pictures that could capture the imagination of audiences. Walter Elias Disney was born on December 5th, 1901, in a modest two-story cottage on Tripp Avenue in the Hermosa neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. His father, Elias Disney, was a restless man of Irish-Canadian descent who struggled throughout his life to find stable employment and financial security. His mother, Flora Disney, was a patient woman of German-American heritage who provided what emotional stability she could in a household defined by her husband's stern demeanor and constant economic anxiety. Walt was the fourth of 5 children, and from his earliest years, he demonstrated an unusual fascination with drawing and visual storytelling. When Walt was 4 years old, the Disney family made a decision that would profoundly shape his creative imagination. Elias Disney, frustrated with the cramped conditions and moral dangers of urban Chicago, purchased a 45-acre farm near the small town of Marceline, Missouri, a quiet agricultural community located approximately 100 miles northeast of Kansas City. For young Walt, Marceline was nothing short of paradise. The rolling farmland, the friendly neighbors, the simple main street lined with local businesses, the animals that roamed the property, all of these images imprinted themselves onto his developing consciousness with an intensity that he would never forget. He later described his years in Marceline as the happiest of his entire childhood, and scholars have long recognized that the idealized vision of small-town America that would eventually manifest in Disneyland's Main Street, USA, was directly inspired by his memories of this quiet Missouri town. It was in Marceline that Walt Disney first picked up a pencil and began to draw with serious intent. A neighbor named Doc Sherwood, a retired physician who lived nearby, recognized the boy's talent and paid him a small sum to draw a portrait of his horse, Rupert. This was Walt Disney's first paid artistic commission, and though the money was insignificant, the validation it provided was profound. He began to see that his drawings might have value beyond mere personal amusement. He began to understand that art could be something more than a hobby. But the idyllic life in Marceline was not destined to last. In 1910, when Walt was just 8 years old, Elias Disney fell seriously ill with typhoid fever and was no longer able to manage the demanding physical labor required to run a working farm. The family was forced to sell the property and relocate once again, this time to Kansas City, where Elias purchased a newspaper delivery route. The Kansas City years were formative for Walt, but they were also brutally difficult. Elias expected his sons to help with the newspaper deliveries, which meant that Walt and his brother Roy would wake before dawn every single day, regardless of weather, to deliver copies of the Kansas City Star and the Kansas City Times to hundreds of subscribers across a demanding route. The work was exhausting, and Elias was not a gentle taskmaster. He believed in strict discipline and was not above using physical punishment to enforce compliance. Walt later recalled these years with a complicated mixture of resentment and reluctant gratitude. The experience taught him the value of hard work, but it also planted in him a deep-seated fear of poverty and financial insecurity that would drive his ambitions for the rest of his life. He never wanted to be at the mercy of circumstances the way his father had been. He never wanted to feel powerless. Throughout his teenage years in Kansas City, Walt continued to develop his artistic skills. He took Saturday classes at the Kansas City Art Institute, where he learned the fundamentals of drawing, anatomy, and composition. He also became fascinated with the emerging world of motion pictures, spending what little money he could save on tickets to the local movie theaters, where he watched the flickering images on the screen with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He understood, even at this young age, that the moving picture was something revolutionary, a new form of storytelling that could combine visual art with narrative in ways that had never before been possible. And when he discovered that some filmmakers were actually creating drawings that appeared to move, drawings that came to life through the magic of animation, he knew that he had found his calling. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Walt was just 15 years old, too young to enlist in the military, but he was desperate to participate in the great adventure of war. And so he forged his birth documents to make himself appear a year older and applied to serve as an ambulance driver for the American Red Cross. He was accepted and shipped overseas to France in late 1918, arriving just as the armistice was being signed. He never saw combat, but he spent nearly a year in post-war France, driving ambulances and transporting supplies for the Red Cross. During this time, he continued to draw, decorating his ambulance with cartoons and even selling some of his sketches to fellow servicemen. When he finally returned to the United States in 1919, he was no longer a boy. He was a young man with a clear sense of purpose. He was going to become an artist, and not just any artist. He was going to make drawings that moved. Upon returning from France, Walt Disney made a decision that would set the course of his entire life. Rather than return to Chicago, where his parents had relocated, he chose to remain in Kansas City, the city where he had spent his formative adolescent years, and where he believed he would have the best chance of breaking into the commercial art business. He was 18 years old, filled with confidence and creative energy, and utterly naive about the harsh realities of the professional world he was about to enter. His first job came quickly. A friend helped him secure a position at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio, a small advertising firm that created illustrations, catalogs, and promotional materials for local businesses. The pay was modest, just $50 a month, but Walt was thrilled to be working as a professional artist. He threw himself into the work with characteristic enthusiasm, learning the techniques of commercial illustration and absorbing everything he could about the business of visual communication. It was at Pesman Rubin that Walt Disney met a young artist who would become one of the most important collaborators of his entire career. His name was Ube Ert Iwerks, though he would later simplify this difficult Dutch name to Ub Iwerks. He was a quiet, introverted young man, the son of a German immigrant barber who had abandoned the family when Ub was a child. Where Walt was outgoing, charming, and brimming with entrepreneurial energy, Ub was reserved, technically brilliant, and almost obsessively focused on the craft of drawing. Their personalities complemented each other perfectly. Walt had the vision and the salesmanship. Ubi had the technical skill and the patience for painstaking detail work. Together, They formed a creative partnership that would ultimately change the history of American entertainment, though neither of them could have imagined such a future at the time. The job at Pesman Rubin was short-lived. In early 1920, the company lost several major accounts, and Walt and Ub were both laid off as part of the resulting downsizing. But rather than see this setback as a disaster, the two young artists decided to view it as an opportunity. They would start their own commercial art company. With virtually no capital and even less business experience, they launched iWorks Disney Commercial Artists, renting a small office space and attempting to attract clients through sheer hustle and determination. The venture lasted barely a month. They managed to attract a few small clients, but not nearly enough to pay the rent and sustain 2 salaries. Recognizing that he needed a steady income, Walt took a job at the Kansas City Film Ad Company, a local firm that produced animated advertisements for businesses in the Kansas City area. It was at this company that Walt Disney would receive his first real education in the art and science of animation. The Kansas City Film Ad Company specialized in creating simple animated commercials that were shown in local movie theaters before the main feature. The animation was crude by later standards, consisting primarily of static cutout figures that were moved incrementally across the screen. But for Walt Disney, it was a revelation. He watched the experienced animators at work, studied their techniques, and began to understand the basic principles that made drawings appear to move. He devoured every book and manual he could find on the subject, including the pioneering works of animation theorists like Emil Cole and Winsor McKay. He experimented constantly, staying late at the office to try new techniques and test the limits of the medium. And gradually, he began to develop his own vision for what animation could become. He saw beyond the simple, jerky movements of the cutout advertisements that the Kansas City Film Ad Company produced. He envisioned fully animated characters that move with fluidity and grace, characters that could express emotion, tell stories, and captivate audiences in ways that live-action films could not. By 1921, Walt Disney had become consumed by a single ambition. He wanted to create his own animated films that would transcend the limitations of advertising and stand on their own as works of entertainment. He began experimenting with a borrowed camera in his spare time, creating short animated sequences in a makeshift studio he set up in his family's garage. He convinced iWorks to join him in this new venture, and together they began working on a series of short animated films that reimagined classic fairy tales. The results were promising enough that Walt decided to take the leap. He would quit his job at the Kansas City Film Ad Company and launch his own animation studio. It was a bold decision, perhaps even a reckless one, for a young man with no capital, no business experience, and no guaranteed market for his work. But Walt Disney had always possessed an almost irrational belief in his own abilities. He was convinced that if he could just create something truly special, the world would recognize its value. In May of 1921, Walt Disney officially incorporated Laugh-O-Gram Films, Incorporated, establishing the company in the state of Missouri with an initial capitalization of $15,000, and we raised through small investments from local businessmen and professionals who were charmed by the young animator's enthusiasm and bold promises. A modest 3-story brick building that had previously housed a variety of businesses. Walt rented space on the second floor, which he converted into a working animation studio complete with drawing tables, camera equipment, and a small dark room for developing film. The building was hardly glamorous, but for Walt Disney, it represented the realization of a dream. He was just 19 years old, and he was the head of his own animation company. The staff that Walt assembled for Laugh-O-Gram Films was small but talented. In addition to iWorks, who served as the studio's primary animator and technical expert, Walt recruited several other young artists from the Kansas City area, including Hugh Harmon, Rudolph Ising, Carmen Maxwell, and Lori Tague. Most of these young men were barely out of their teenage years, inexperienced but eager to learn and willing to work for minimal wages, in exchange for the opportunity to be part of something exciting. The atmosphere at the studio was informal and collaborative, with Walt serving as the creative leader and chief salesman, while Ubba and the other animators handled the demanding technical work of actually producing the films. They worked long hours, often 7 days a week, driven by a shared belief that they were creating something that mattered. The business model that Walt envisioned for Laugh-O-Gram films was straightforward in concept, but challenging in execution. He would produce a series of short animated films based on classic fairy tales, stories that were in the public domain and therefore free of copyright restrictions. These films would then be sold to theater owners and distributors across the country, generating revenue that would allow the studio to produce more films and gradually expand its operations. Walt's first successful sale came early when he convinced the Newman Theater Company, a local theater chain, to purchase a series of short topical cartoons called Newman Laugh-O-Grams that poked fun at local Kansas City issues and events. These shorts were popular with audiences and generated modest income, providing the young studio with its first taste of commercial success. Encouraged by this initial success, Walt pushed forward with his plan to produce more ambitious fairy tale adaptations. Over the following year, Laugh-O-Gram Films produced a series of 7-minute animated shorts including modernized versions of Little Red Riding Hood, The Four Musicians of Bremen, Jack and the Beanstalk, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Puss in Boots, and Cinderella. These films were technically impressive for their time, featuring fully animated characters rather than the static cutouts that were common in most animated advertisements of the era. Walt experimented with humor, timing, and visual gags, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of what audiences found entertaining. The films were clever, well-crafted, and showed genuine artistic promise. But there was a fundamental problem with Laugh-O-Gram films that all the artistic talent in the world could not solve. Walt Disney, for all his creative genius, had virtually no understanding of business, finance, or the harsh economic realities of the entertainment industry. He had sold his fairy tale shorts to a distribution company called Pictorial Clubs, Incorporated, based in Tennessee, for a sum that seemed substantial at the time, $11,000 for the entire package of completed and planned films. But Walt had made a critical error in the terms of the contract. He had agreed to deliver the films before receiving payment, trusting that the money would arrive once the work was complete. He had also vastly underestimated the cost of producing animation, which was a labor-intensive process that consumed far more time and resources than he had anticipated. By the time the fairy tale shorts were completed and delivered, Laugh-O-Gram Films had spent nearly all of its initial investment. The studio was counting on the payment from Pictorial Clubs to stay afloat. And then disaster struck. Pictorial Clubs went bankrupt before paying Laugh-O-Gram Films a single dollar. The collapse of Pictorial Clubs in early 1923 was a death blow from which Laugh-O-Gram Films would never recover. Walt Disney suddenly found himself in an impossible situation. He had delivered thousands of dollars worth of completed animation work, for which he would receive nothing. He owed money to investors, creditors, suppliers, and landlords. He could no longer afford to pay his staff, and one by one, all the talented young artists he had assembled began to drift away, seeking employment elsewhere. Ub Iwerks left to take a job at another Kansas City firm. Hugh Harmon and Rudolph Ising found work at other studios. The creative team that Walt had so carefully built simply evaporated as the money ran out. But Walt Disney refused to give up. Even as his studio crumbled around him, he continued to work, searching desperately for some project that might save the company and allow him to pay off his debts. He accepted whatever small jobs he could find, including a commission to film babies for local families. A humiliating step down from his dreams of animated entertainment. He lived in the studio building itself, sleeping on cushions on the floor because he could no longer afford rent on a separate apartment. He survived on canned beans and other cheap foods that required no cooking because the gas had been shut off. The electricity followed soon after. In the cold Kansas City winter, Walt Disney huddled in a dark, unheated building, continuing to draw by the light from the windows, refusing to admit defeat. It was during this desperate period that Walt conceived of a project that represented his last, best hope of saving Laugh-O-Gram Films. He would create a new kind of film, one that combined live-action footage with animated characters, a technique that had been pioneered by other studios but never fully exploited. The film would be called Alice's Wonderland, and it would feature a real little girl interacting with animated characters in an animated world. The concept was ambitious, innovative, indie and potentially marketable to distributors who were hungry for fresh content. Walt cast a young local girl named Virginia Davis as Alice and began production on the film with whatever resources he could scrape together. He begged, borrowed, and improvised, using every ounce of his resourcefulness to keep the project moving forward. But it was not enough. By the summer of 1923, Laugh-O-Gram Films was completely insolvent. The company officially declared bankruptcy, and Walt Disney was forced to confront the complete and total failure of his first business venture. He was 21 years old, thousands of dollars in debt, and utterly humiliated. His investors had lost their money, his employees had scattered, his grand vision of building an animation empire in Kansas City had collapsed into nothing. All he had to show for 2 years of relentless work was a single unfinished reel of film, the incomplete Alice's Wonderland, which sat in a can with no distributor and no clear future. What happens to a young man when his first great dream collapses into bankruptcy and disgrace? For some, such a failure would be the end, a psychological blow from which they would never fully recover. But Walter Elias Disney was not destined to be destroyed by his failure in Kansas City. Instead, he made a decision that would alter the trajectory of American entertainment forever. He would leave Kansas City behind. He would travel to California, where his older brother Roy was living while recovering from tuberculosis. And he would start over, completely and absolutely, in the place where dreams were manufactured on an industrial scale, Hollywood. In July of 1923, Walt Disney boarded a train bound for Los Angeles with nothing but a cardboard suitcase containing a few items of clothing, some basic drawing materials, and that single unfinished reel of Alice's Wonderland. He had $40 in his pocket, money that he had earned by operating his camera and filming local events in Kansas City. He was leaving behind debts that would take him years to repay, a failure that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and a building on East 31st Street that would sit empty and forgotten for decades. But he was also carrying with him something that no creditor could claim and no bankruptcy could diminish: his talent, his vision, and his absolute refusal to accept defeat as final. The journey to California took several days. And Walt had plenty of time to reflect on what had gone wrong and what he might do differently in the future. He arrived in Los Angeles in late July and moved in with his brother Roy and their uncle Robert, who had a small house in the city. Walt initially believed that his career in animation was finished. He intended to seek work as a director or cameraman in the live-action film industry, using the skills he had developed at the Kansas City Film Ad Company to break into the booming Hollywood movie business. But the studios were not interested in an unknown young man from Kansas City with no connections and no track record. Walt faced rejection after rejection, and for a brief period, it seemed as though his California adventure might end in the same failure that had consumed his efforts in Kansas City. But Walt Disney still had that reel of Alice's Wonderland, and almost as an afterthought, he decided to try one more time to sell the concept to distributors. He sent inquiry letters to several distribution companies in New York, including one operated by a woman named Margaret Winkler, who had become one of the most successful independent distributors of animated content in the country. Margaret Winkler had built her business by distributing the popular Out of the Inkwell series, produced by the Fleischer Brothers, and the Felix the Cat cartoons. She was actively looking for new content to add to her catalog, and when she received Walt's letter describing his innovative Alice Comedies concept, she was intrigued. In October of 1923, Margaret Winkler sent Walt Disney a letter that would change everything. She offered him a contract to produce a series of Alice comedies, short films combining live action with animation, at a rate of $1,500 per film. For Walt, who had been surviving on hope and determination for months, the offer was nothing short of miraculous. He immediately wired his acceptance and began making arrangements to start production. The contract from Margaret Winkler arrived like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. For Walt Disney, who had spent months wandering the streets of Hollywood, seeking any opportunity that might allow him to continue his career, the offer of $1,500 per film represented not merely financial salvation, but something far more profound: validation. Someone in the world of professional entertainment believed that his ideas had commercial value. Someone was willing to bet real money on his creative vision. The psychological impact of this validation cannot be overstated. Walt had arrived in California carrying the weight of complete failure on his young shoulders, and now, suddenly, he had been given a second chance that he was determined not to squander. But there was an immediate practical problem. Walt Disney had no studio, no equipment, no staff, and virtually no money. The Winkler contract specified delivery deadlines that would require him to begin production almost immediately, yet he possessed none of the infrastructure necessary to create professional animated films. It was at this critical moment that Walt turned to the person who would become his most important partner for the rest of his life. His older brother, Roy Oliver Disney. Roy was 8 years older than Walt, and he had spent much of the previous 2 years in Los Angeles recovering from tuberculosis at a veterans hospital. He had been planning to return to Kansas City to resume his career in banking once his health improved, but Walt's passionate appeals convinced him to take a different path. On October 16, 1923, the Disney Brothers cartoon studio was officially established, with Roy handling the business operations and Walt directing the creative efforts. The brothers pooled their meager resources, combining what little savings they had with a $500 loan from their uncle Robert Disney. The rent was just $10 per month, and the space was barely adequate for their needs, but it was enough. Walt set up his drawing table, installed a secondhand camera that he had purchased for $200, and began production on the first official Alice comedy, which would be titled Alice's Day at Sea. The work was demanding and the conditions were primitive, but Walt attacked the project with the same relentless energy that had characterized his efforts in Kansas City. One of Walt's first priorities was to reassemble the creative team that had made Laugh-O-Gram films possible. He wrote letters to Kansas City, reaching out to the artists who had worked with him before the bankruptcy. Most importantly, he contacted Iwerks, the brilliant animator whose technical skills had been so essential to the Laugh-O-Gram productions. Ib was initially hesitant to leave his stable job in Kansas City for another uncertain venture with Walt Disney, but Walt was nothing if not persuasive. He promised a salary, a partnership, and the opportunity to help build something significant from the ground up. In early 1924, Iwerks arrived in Los Angeles and rejoined his old friend and collaborator. The creative core of what would eventually become the Disney Empire was now in place. The Alice comedies required Walt to solve a logistical challenge that had defeated his efforts in Kansas City. He needed a child actress to play the live-action role of Alice. Virginia Davis, the young girl who had starred in the original Alice's Wonderland pilot, was still living in Kansas City with her family. Walt wrote to Virginia's parents, describing the contract he had secured and the opportunity that awaited in California. The Davis family was sufficiently impressed by Walt's enthusiasm and the apparent legitimacy of the Winkler contract that they agreed to relocate to Los Angeles, allowing Virginia to continue her role as Alice. It was a testament to Walt's powers of persuasion that he could convince an entire family to uproot their lives and move across the country based on his assurances. This ability to inspire others to believe in his vision, even when the evidence for that vision's success was minimal, would prove to be one of Walt Disney's most valuable assets throughout his career. The production process for the Alice comedies was grueling but exhilarating. Each short film required the seamless integration of live-action footage, featuring Virginia Davis with animated sequences created frame by frame by Walt, and the small team of artists they gradually assembled. The technique involved filming Virginia against a white background, then printing the developed footage onto animation paper so that the animated elements could be drawn around her. The process was time-consuming and technically demanding, requiring precise registration between the live-action and animated elements. But the results were charming and visually innovative, and Margaret Winkler was pleased with the quality of the film she received. As the Alice comedies found their audience, the Disney Brothers cartoon studio began to grow. The tiny space behind the real estate office was soon inadequate for the expanding operation, and in early 1924, the brothers moved to a larger storefront location at 4649 Kingswell Avenue, just next door to their original quarters. They hired additional animators and inkers, including Rollin Hamilton, Thurston Harper, and later Hugh Harman and Rudolph Ising. who had worked with Walt at Laugh-O-Gram Films. The atmosphere at the studio was collaborative and intense, with Walt pushing his team to constantly improve the quality and sophistication of their work. He was never satisfied with merely meeting expectations. He wanted each film to be better than the last, and he demanded the same commitment from everyone around him. But even as the Alice comedies were achieving commercial success, trouble was brewing in New York. Margaret Winkler had married a man named Charles Mintz in 1924, and her new husband gradually assumed control of her distribution business. Charles Mintz was a very different personality from his wife. Where Margaret had been a savvy but fundamentally fair businesswoman who maintained respectful relationships with her content producers, Charles was aggressive, domineering, and ruthlessly focused on maximizing his own profits, often at the expense of the artists and studios he worked with. He began inserting himself into the relationship between the Winkler Distribution Company and the Disney Brothers cartoon studio, demanding greater control over the content of the films and constantly pressuring Walt to reduce his production costs. Walt Disney found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He needed the Winkler distribution contract to survive, but he chafed under the heavy-handed management style of Charles Mintz. The two men clashed repeatedly over creative and financial matters, with Mintz viewing Walt as an expendable content supplier, and Walt viewing Mintz as a meddlesome businessman who understood nothing about the art of animation. Despite these tensions, the relationship continued because both parties needed each other. As Mintz needed quality animated content to distribute to theaters across the country, and Walt needed access to the distribution networks that only Mintz could provide. It was a marriage of convenience that neither party found particularly pleasant, but it worked well enough to keep the money flowing and the films in production. By 1926, after producing dozens of Alice comedies over the course of 3 years, Walt began to sense that the series was running out of creative steam. Virginia Davis had grown older and was eventually replaced by other child actresses, including Margie Gay and Lois Hardwick, but the fundamental premise of the series was becoming stale. Audiences had seen enough of little girls interacting with animated characters, and Walt recognized that he needed something new if he was going to maintain his momentum in the increasingly competitive animation market. He began developing ideas for a new character, an entirely animated protagonist who could carry a series without the complexities and limitations of live-action integration. He was looking for something fresh, something distinctive, something that audiences would remember and demand to see again. The character that emerged from Walt Disney's creative brainstorming sessions in late 1926 was a rabbit. Not just any rabbit, but a mischievous, energetic, distinctly American rabbit with long, floppy ears, a round body, and an expressive face capable of conveying a wide range of emotions. Walt named this character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, whereas he believed that Oswald had the potential to become a genuine star, a character who could anchor an entire series of theatrical shorts and build the kind of audience loyalty that translated into consistent box office returns. The design of Oswald was primarily the work of Ub Iwerks, whose draftsmanship had become even more refined and sophisticated during the years of producing Alice comedies. Oswald was appealing, dynamic, and immediately recognizable, exactly the kind of character that could cut through the crowded landscape of 1920s animation. Walt brought the concept of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit to Charles Mintz, who agreed that the character had commercial potential. Mintz, in turn, approached Universal Pictures, one of the major Hollywood studios, with a proposal to distribute the Oswald series under the Universal banner. Universal executives were impressed with the sample films that Walt produced and agreed to a distribution deal. The first official Oswald cartoon, titled Trolley Troubles, was released in September of 1927, and it was an immediate success with both audiences and critics. The trade publications praised the quality of the animation and the appeal of the central character. Theater owners reported strong audience reactions. For Walt Disney, the success of Oswald seemed to validate everything he had been working toward since his days at Laugh-O-Gram Films. He had finally created a character that the public genuinely loved. The Oswald series continued to thrive throughout late 1927 and into early 1928. Walt and his team produced one new Oswald cartoon approximately every 2 weeks, an exhausting pace that required the studio to operate at maximum capacity. The films grew more sophisticated with each installment, featuring more elaborate gags, more fluid animation, and more complex storylines. Walt was earning a reputation within the industry as one of the most innovative and reliable producers of animated content. He began to believe that his days of financial struggle were finally behind him. He and Roy had moved the studio once again, this time to a new facility at 2719 Hyperion Avenue in the Silver Lake neighborhood of Los Angeles, a proper animation studio that could accommodate the growing team and the increasingly ambitious productions. For the first time since his Kansas City disaster, Walt Disney allowed himself to feel genuinely optimistic about the future. But Walt Disney was about to learn a devastating lesson about the entertainment business, a lesson about contracts, ownership, and the dangers of trusting the wrong people. This lesson would arrive in February of 1928, when Walt traveled to New York City to renegotiate his contract with Charles Mintz. He was confident going into the meeting. The Oswald series was a proven success. He had delivered quality product consistently and on schedule. He expected Mintz to offer him improved terms, perhaps a higher fee per cartoon, or a longer-term commitment. He expected to return to Los Angeles with good news for his brother Roy and his team of animators. What he found instead was a trap that had been carefully prepared for months, like a scheme so cold-blooded and calculated that it would forever change how Walt Disney approached business relationships. The meeting with Charles Mintz took place in Mintz's office in New York, and from the first moments of the conversation, Walt sensed that something was terribly wrong. Rather than offering improved terms, Mintz informed Walt that he would be reducing the fee paid for each Oswald cartoon, cutting the amount by a significant margin. Walt was stunned by this demand. The series was successful. The films were making money. Why would Mintz demand less favorable terms rather than more? But Mintz was not finished. He proceeded to explain, in calm and businesslike tones, that if Walt refused to accept the reduced fees, Mintz would simply continue producing Oswald cartoons without him. He had the right to do so, Mintz explained, because under the terms of the original contract, the character of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was not owned by Walt Disney or the Disney Brothers cartoon studio. Oswald was owned by Universal Pictures, with Charles Mintz controlling the production rights through his distribution agreement. Walt Disney sat in that New York office and felt the ground give way beneath him. He had created Oswald. His team had designed the character, developed the stories, animated every frame of every cartoon. And yet, through a contract clause that he had apparently signed without fully understanding its implications, he owned nothing. The character that he had poured his creative energy into, the character that was finally bringing him the success he had dreamed of since his Kansas City days, belonged to someone else. But the betrayal did not end there. Mintz revealed the full extent of his scheme with evident satisfaction. He had spent the previous months secretly contacting Walt's animators, offering them jobs working directly for him at higher salaries. Most of the Disney staff had already agreed to defect. When Walt returned to Los Angeles, he would find his studio nearly empty. Mintz would have the character, the distribution network, and the trained animators. Walt Disney would have nothing. The full weight of what had happened crashed over Walt like a wave. He had been systematically betrayed by a business partner who had been plotting against him for months. The animators he had trained, the artists he had mentored and brought to California from Kansas City, had secretly agreed to abandon him for a better paycheck. Everything he had built since arriving in Los Angeles was about to be taken from him, not through honest competition or creative failure, but through calculated deception and legal maneuvering. For a young man who had already experienced the complete collapse of his first company just 5 years earlier, the Oswald betrayal was an almost unbearable blow. He had trusted Charles Mintz. He had trusted his own employees, and that trust had been weaponized against him. Walt attempted to negotiate, to find some compromise that would allow him to retain some connection to the character he had created. But Mintz was unmoved. He held all the cards, and he knew it. The contract was clear. Oswald belonged to Universal. If Walt refused to work under the reduced terms, Mintz would simply hire someone else to continue the series. In the end, Walt was faced with an impossible choice: submit to Mintz's demands and become little more than a hired hand working on someone else's character, or walk away from Oswald entirely and start over yet again. For Walt Disney, the choice was clear. He would never again put himself in a position where someone else controlled his creative destiny. He would never again create a character that he did not own. He thanked Charles Mintz for his time, stood up from his chair, and walked out of the office. The train ride back to Los Angeles was one of the longest journeys of Walt Disney's life. He had hours to sit alone with his thoughts, hours to process the magnitude of the betrayal he had just experienced, hours to contemplate what came next. He had lost his star character. He had lost most of his animation staff. He had lost years of work and creative investment. By any reasonable measure, he had been completely defeated. And yet, somewhere in the rhythmic motion of the train, somewhere in the vast American landscape passing by his window, Walt Disney began to think not about what he had lost, but about what he might create next. The exact details of what happened during that train journey have become the subject of considerable historical debate. According to the most famous version of the story, a version that Walt himself told many times over the years, the idea for a new character came to him spontaneously during the train ride home. He began sketching a mouse, a simple, appealing mouse character that could serve as the foundation for an entirely new series of cartoons. Walt claimed that he was inspired by a pet mouse he had kept in his Kansas City studio during the Laugh-O-Gram days, a friendly creature that he had named Mortimer and that would climb onto his drawing table while he worked. He decided to name his new character Mortimer Mouse, though his wife Lillian, whom he had married in 1925, later convinced him that the name sounded too pompous. She suggested Mickey instead, and Walt agreed. Mickey Mouse was born. Historians have questioned various aspects of this origin story over the years. Some scholars believe that the character design was developed primarily by Ub Iwerks after Walt returned to Los Angeles, rather than on the train itself. Others have noted that Mickey Mouse bears a suspicious resemblance to Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, with many of the same design elements simply modified to transform a rabbit into a mouse. The round head, the large eyes, the button nose, the expressive body language, all of these features were directly adapted from the Oswald template. What seems clear from the historical record is that both Walt and UB contributed to the development of Mickey Mouse, with Walt providing the conceptual vision and Ub executing the technical design work that brought the character to life on paper. The question of who deserves primary credit for creating Mickey Mouse would become a source of tension between the two men in later years. But in the spring of 1928, they were united by a common purpose: survival. When Walt returned to Los Angeles and informed Roy about the disaster in New York, the brothers faced a critical decision. They could accept defeat and close the studio, or they could fight back by creating something new. For Walt, there was only one acceptable option. He would not allow Charles Mintz to destroy everything he had worked for. He gathered the few animators who had remained loyal, most notably Ub Iwerks, and began work on the first Mickey Mouse cartoon in absolute secrecy. They could not allow Mintz or his spies to learn about the new character until it was too late for anyone to interfere. While Walt was still contractually obligated to deliver a few final Oswald cartoons to Mintz, Ub worked feverishly behind closed doors, single-handedly animating the first Mickey Mouse short at a pace that bordered on superhuman. He produced approximately 700 drawings per day, an almost unbelievable output that allowed the studio to complete the first Mickey film in just a few weeks. The first Mickey Mouse cartoon was titled Plain Crazy, and it was directly inspired by the public fascination with Charles Lindbergh's famous transatlantic flight of 1927. The short featured Mickey as an ambitious aviator attempting to impress his girlfriend Minnie by building and flying his own airplane, with predictably chaotic results. The animation was lively, the gags were clever. Fresin Mickey himself radiated a kind of plucky charm that was immediately appealing. Walt arranged test screenings for industry insiders and received positive feedback, but he struggled to find a distributor willing to take on the new series. The major studios and independent distributors were skeptical about a character created by a producer who had just lost his previous property in a contract dispute. The shadow of the Oswald disaster followed Walt as he attempted to sell Mickey Mouse, and for several months it seemed possible that his new character might never reach a wide audience. But Walt Disney had one more innovation up his sleeve, an innovation that would transform Mickey Mouse from an obscure cartoon character into a global phenomenon. By the summer of 1928, a technological revolution was sweeping through the motion picture industry. Warner Brothers had released The Jazz Singer in October of 1927, the first feature film with synchronized dialogue and musical sequences. The talkies had arrived, and audiences were hungry for sound. Most animation studios were slow to adapt to this new technology, viewing synchronized sound as an expensive and technically challenging novelty. Walt Disney saw it differently. He recognized that synchronized sound was not just a gimmick, but a fundamental transformation of the medium, and he was determined to be at the forefront of this revolution. Rather than release Plain Crazy as a silent cartoon, Walt decided to hold it back and create a third Mickey Mouse short that would be specifically designed around synchronized sound. And this new cartoon would be called Steamboat Willie, and it would feature Mickey Mouse in a musical adventure aboard a riverboat, with the animation precisely synchronized to a musical soundtrack. The technical challenges involved in this undertaking were immense. Walt had to develop a system for recording sound that would remain in perfect synchronization with the projected images, a problem that had bedeviled filmmakers since the earliest days of cinema. He experimented with various approaches, finally settling on a method that involved recording the soundtrack after the animation was complete, using a metronome and timing marks to ensure precise coordination between the visual and audio elements. The recording session for Steamboat Willie took place in New York in September of 1928, using a sound system operated by Pat Powers, an independent producer who controlled the rights to a bootleg version of Western Electric's sound-on-film technology. The session was expensive and technically difficult, but the results were extraordinary. When Steamboat Willie premiered at the Colony Theater in New York City on November 18, 1928, audiences experienced something they had never seen before, a cartoon in which the characters appeared to actually create the sounds they made, in which the music and the movement were perfectly unified, in which the animated world seemed genuinely alive. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Critics praised the technical achievement and the entertainment value of the short. Audiences demanded to see it again and again. Mickey Mouse became an overnight sensation. The success of Steamboat Willie transformed the Disney Brothers cartoon studio from a struggling operation on the brink of collapse into one of the most talked about production companies in Hollywood. Within months, Mickey Mouse had become one of the most recognized characters in American popular culture. Merchandise featuring the mouse began appearing in stores across the country. Fan mail poured into the studio. Theater owners clamored for more Mickey Mouse cartoons, willing to pay premium prices for the privilege of showing them. Walt Disney, who just 1 year earlier had been betrayed and nearly destroyed by Charles Mintz, had achieved a triumph that exceeded his wildest ambitions. But Walt never forgot the lesson he had learned from the Oswald disaster. He insisted on maintaining complete ownership of Mickey Mouse and all future characters created by his studio. He negotiated distribution deals that clearly established Disney ownership of all intellectual property. He built a business structure designed to ensure that no one could ever take his creations away from him again. The betrayal by Charles Mintz had been devastating, but it had also been educational. Walt Disney emerged from that experience with a fundamental understanding of how the entertainment business really worked, an understanding that creative talent without business acumen was vulnerable to exploitation, and that ownership of intellectual property was the key to long-term success and independence. The irony of the Oswald situation was not lost on Walt Disney or on historians who later studied his career. If Charles Mintz had treated Walt fairly, if he had offered reasonable terms and honored the creative partnership that had made the Oswald series successful, Walt Disney might never have created Mickey Mouse. The betrayal, as painful as it was, became the catalyst for something far greater than Oswald the Lucky Rabbit could ever have been. Mickey Mouse was not just a replacement for a lost character, he was a symbol of Walt Disney's resilience, creativity, and determination to control his own destiny. Every time Mickey appeared on screen, he represented a victory over the forces that had tried to destroy his creator. In an extraordinary postscript to this story, nearly 80 years after the original Betrayal, the Walt Disney Company finally reclaimed ownership of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. In February of 2006, Disney negotiated a trade with NBC Universal, acquiring the rights to Oswald in exchange for allowing sportscaster Al Michaels to leave Disney-owned ESPN for NBC's Sunday Night Football coverage. It was one of the strangest trades in entertainment history, a football commentator for a cartoon rabbit, but for Disney executives who understood the symbolic importance of Oswald, the deal represented the closing of a circle that had remained open since 1928. The rabbit that had been stolen from Walt Disney finally came home. As we reach the conclusion of this extraordinary narrative, it is worth pausing to reflect on the deeper meaning of Walt Disney's journey from bankruptcy and betrayal to the creation of one of the most valuable entertainment brands in human history. The story of Laugh-O-Gram Films. Meet Oswald the Lucky Rabbit in the birth of Mickey Mouse is not simply a tale of business success or creative triumph. It is a profound meditation on the nature of failure, resilience, and the unexpected pathways through which greatness often emerges. When Walt Disney sat alone in that dark, empty building on East 31st Street in Kansas City, eating cold beans and wondering if he would ever work in animation again, he could not have imagined what the future held. He could not have known that within a decade, his name would be famous around the world, that his characters would bring joy to millions of children, that his studio would pioneer technologies and storytelling techniques that would shape the entertainment industry for generations to come. All he knew in that moment was that he had failed, that his first great dream had collapsed into dust, and that he had to find some way to move forward, despite the weight of that failure pressing down upon him. What separated Walt Disney from the countless other dreamers who have failed and never recovered was not merely talent, though he possessed that in abundance. It was not merely luck, though fortune certainly played a role in his eventual success. What truly distinguished Walt Disney was his absolute refusal to accept failure as final. He treated the bankruptcy of Laugh-O-Gram Films not as an ending, but as a painful lesson. He treated the betrayal by Charles Mintz not as a defeat, but as an opportunity to create something even better. He understood, perhaps instinctively, that the path to success is almost never straight, that setbacks and disappointments are not obstacles to be avoided, but crucibles through which character and capability are forged. The story of Walt Disney's early struggles also contains important lessons about the relationship between creativity and business, between artistic vision and commercial reality. Walt was a creative genius, but in his early career, he was naive about the business side of the entertainment industry. He signed contracts without fully understanding their implications. He trusted partners who did not deserve his trust. He focused on the art while neglecting the economics. The Oswald disaster forced him to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how business actually works. He learned to read contracts carefully, to maintain ownership of his intellectual property, to build organizational structures that protected his creative independence. These lessons, learned through bitter experience, became the foundation upon which the Disney empire was built. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Walt Disney's first studio reminds us that behind every great success lies a history of struggle, failure, and perseverance that is rarely visible from the outside. When we see the gleaming towers of Disneyland and Disney World, when we watch the latest Pixar masterpiece or Marvel blockbuster, when we observe the vast global enterprise that bears Walt Disney's name, it is easy to assume that such success was somehow inevitable, that it was the natural outcome of exceptional talent meeting favorable circumstances. But the truth is far more complicated and far more inspiring. The Walt Disney Company exists today because a young man refused to give up when everything seemed lost. It exists because a devastating betrayal became the catalyst for extraordinary creativity. It exists because failure, properly understood, is not the opposite of success, but often its necessary precursor. The building at 1127 East 31st Street in Kansas City, where Laugh-O-Gram Films once operated and where Walt Disney experienced his first great failure, still stands today. For many years, it sat neglected and forgotten, a crumbling reminder of dreams that had collapsed nearly a century ago. But in recent decades, efforts have been made to preserve and restore this historic structure, to honor it as the birthplace of an entertainment legacy that has touched billions of lives around the world. The Thank You Walt Disney Organization and other preservation groups have worked to ensure that future generations will be able to visit the place where it all began, where a young animator with no money and no connections dared to imagine that he could create something the world had never seen before. Charles Mintz, the man who betrayed Walt Disney and stole Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, continued in the animation business for several years after the 1928 incident, but his career never achieved the heights that Disney's would reach. The Oswald series continued under various producers, But without Walt's creative vision, it gradually declined in popularity and was eventually discontinued. Mintz himself faded into obscurity, remembered today primarily as the villain in Walt Disney's origin story. For the antagonist whose treachery inadvertently created the conditions for Mickey Mouse to be born. There's a certain poetic justice in this outcome, a reminder that those who achieve success through betrayal and exploitation rarely enjoy lasting triumph. Iwerks, the brilliant animator who designed Mickey Mouse and single-handedly animated the first Mickey cartoons, had a more complicated relationship with Walt Disney in the years that followed. The two men had a falling out in 1930, and left to start his own studio, which ultimately failed. He returned to Disney in 1940 and spent the rest of his career developing technical innovations for the company, including contributions to the audio animatronics technology used in Disney theme parks. He was awarded 2 Academy Awards for technical achievement before his death in 1971. The creative partnership between Walt and forged in the struggles of their youth, remained one of the most significant collaborations in animation history, even if it was complicated by personal and professional tensions. And so we come to the end of our journey through this remarkable chapter of American business and entertainment history. We began with a young man sitting alone in a dark building, surrounded by the wreckage of his first company, wondering if he would ever achieve his dreams. We followed him across the country to California, where he built a new studio from nothing, created a successful series of Alice comedies, and developed a character named Oswald that seemed destined for stardom. We witnessed the devastating betrayal that stripped him of everything he had built, and we watched as he transformed that disaster into the creation of Mickey Mouse, a character who would become one of the most beloved and recognizable figures in global popular culture. The dark story of Walt Disney's first studio is ultimately a story about the transformative power of adversity. It teaches us that failure is not something to be feared or avoided, but something to be learned from and transcended. It reminds us that the most successful people are often those who have experienced the deepest failures, who have been knocked down repeatedly and have found the strength to rise again each time. And it demonstrates that behind the gleaming facade of every great enterprise lies a human story of struggle, perseverance, dare in the refusal to accept defeat as final. For those of you who have watched this entire documentary, thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If these stories of ambition, failure, and ultimate triumph resonate with you, if you find value in understanding the hidden struggles behind the world's greatest successes, then I encourage you to subscribe to Coded Dark Wealth and turn on notifications so you never miss our next exploration of the darker, more complex stories behind the fortunes and empires that have shaped our world. The lessons of history are all around us, waiting to be discovered, waiting to inspire, waiting to remind us that even the most impossible dreams can become reality if we have the courage to pursue them despite every obstacle, every setback, and every betrayal that stands in our way. Walt Disney once said, "All our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them." He spoke those words not as someone for whom success had come easily, but as someone who had experienced the depths of failure and had found within himself the strength to begin again. That is his true legacy, not just the theme parks and the movies and the merchandise, but the example of a human being who refused to let circumstances define his destiny. And that example remains as powerful and as relevant today as it was nearly a century ago, when a young man with $40 and a cardboard suitcase stepped off a train in Los Angeles, determined to prove that his story was not over. It was only just beginning.